بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسولنا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك وأنعم على حبيبنا محمد. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك وأنعم على حبيبنا محمد. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك وأنعم على حبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum and hello to everyone who's joining us. It's a pleasure to be with Shaykh Yasir and Shaykh Osamah again. It's a pleasure to be with everyone else who's listening in and engaging us online. As always, I want to begin by asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless this session, bless these moments that we're going to spend together, that He purifies the intention of Shaykh Yasir, Shaykh Osamah, and myself, and everyone listening, that He makes this a time of worship and a time that's counted for us on the day that we meet Him and not against us, and that He brings goodness and blessings from these endeavors and these discussions that we're having, and that He guides our hearts and our tongues to seek the truth and speak the truth, and inshallah see the truth for what it is. It's very nice to see both of my shuyukh. Today is going to be a follow-up to our last session. So this is going to be Religion and Politics Part 2. If you haven't heard part 1, there might be parts of this that you're not going to fully grasp unless you go back and listen to last week's episode. And again, everything's now on YouTube, so you can easily go back. You can also watch it on double speed and get through it a lot quicker if you need to. But I do want to begin with something that we said last week. There was a part of our conversation last week that was we got a lot of feedback on, and I felt like the feedback seemed to suggest to me that many people who heard our conversation didn't fully understand what the point being made was. And so I do want to start there. And the point that it was actually, it seemed to be a very big lightning rod for people. I think it struck a nerve with a lot of people, which is a good thing in a way. But that's when, our shuyukh were talking about the problem of exaggerating the role or the power or the impact of specifically political engagement in the national elections. The way I understood, and I remember the point being made, had nothing to do with the specific candidates or the specific election going on right now. It was a greater conversation around we have to do our best to, we're going to do our best. We're going to make a judgment call, and then we're going to move forward. But there were quite a few people who, listening to us, got the sense that we were diminishing or being dismissive of that mode of engagement. Right. So we spoke quite a bit about the importance of engagement as a whole and the different ways you can engage society, and politics being one of them. One comment that I got that I felt encapsulated the criticism or the concern was, someone told me I felt like I was back in the 90s, right, where the Muslim community was still debating whether or not, voting is halal or haram, right?
Is voting halal or haram?
That's not for me to say.
What did they decide in the 90s?
And so I thought we should start there because quite a few people had comments about that. So I'd like to put it back to our shuyukh to just sort of clarify the comments. I know you guys also saw several of the comments and the questions that came back. So if you whatever you want to say to sort of clarify that position, and then I think we can build on the conversation from there.
Well, I think before I pass it to Shaykh Yasir, I think just to add to that, Maulana, for perspective, a lot of what we were trying to do last week was more about discussing the philosophy of how we approach certain issues and how certain issues impact us spiritually. And, I guess in that arena, it's not necessarily about what to do on the ground locally, because I think we made that clear, that in that type of discussion, we'd love to have certain activists and people who are on the ground involved with us in that discussion. But at the same time, there is a certain reflection to be had about the spiritual and social impact of the way we choose to engage politics. That's on one end. And on the other end, I really think that a lot of what we said was more about giving something that is a means among means greater capacity for or greater consideration in terms of its source of reform for society than it really is. And what I meant by that, inshallah, we're going to tease that out, inshallah, we'll hear from Shaykh Yasir in a little bit more detail, is it's very important that we don't approach those types of things with a very deterministic worldview that, oh, if this doesn't happen, everything is going to go down the drain. The nature of political discussion today is often very, very emotionally charged. And that's part of what we meant by the philosophical approach to engaging politics and the considering the spiritual impact of the way we have chosen to engage a toxic political reality. So I think that's a lot about what I was trying to say and what I understood from Maulana Shaykh Yasir. Not necessarily about the principle of engaging because we all agree, and that's what we actually started the discussion with, is that societal reform is actually something that is a part of faith. It's one of the greatest manifestations of Iman, to be a agent for positive change. Now the question is the political climate conducive to positive change? If so, how? If not, then why not? Allah. Those are some thoughts, introductory thoughts that I had. I'll pass it over to Maulana to give us for the clarity.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. First off, I want to say Jazakumullah khair for really sharing your feedback and engaging us. I don't think I've received more feedback or just thoughts on a session of the meeting point more than this one. I think by far this has been the one that I received the most feedback or thoughts on. And I think that also says something about what we like to engage in general. I mean, this is a political discussion, so people are again actually want to be more involved. The other discussions were almost all centered around issues of spirituality and theology and spiritual development and growth, and let's just say a little bit less so engaging maybe for the masses. But and I think that's something to think about. I think that's something for us to think about just as Muslimin. What kind of really motivates us, what awakens our hearts and our souls, etc. But nonetheless, I mean, I really think that the feedback was what I mean. People really put some time to share feedback, and I appreciate always when someone, as Sayyidina Umar said, "Rahimallahu ra'an ahda ilayya uyubi." May Allah have mercy on the one who gives me as a gift my faults. And one mu'min mir'atu akhi, the believer is the mirror of the believer. And so we have a duty towards one another in terms of lovingly and respectfully giving nasiha, giving feedback. And we won't grow as a community until this adab of tanasuh is really instantiated in our spaces. And it has to be done, I think, in a spirit of qabul, acceptance, and just realizing that the truth is not absolute in our minds and our hearts. No, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the absolute truth. You and I we're trying to negotiate ideas and figure out perspectives, etc. Now, I read a lot of the feedback, and says they just kind of synthesized some of it. I think there's a little bit of a reductionist quality to that feedback with regards to the nature of the conversation. And Shaykh Osamah and I think says they both elucidated. I mean, certainly the conversation of the 90s was a far more black and white, is voting halal haram, right? We didn't even come near to that type of reality. I think our discussion was that's already a given. Voting is halal, and voting is something that is a means. I was very explicit saying that it's a means amongst means, and And I think that, we should certainly be thoughtful about how we are civically engaged. So I don't think we need to kind of beat that with a dead horse, or beat that with a stick anymore. But I think my particular thought process as I was reading the feedback was that I feel, you know, what Islam did for us as believers is Islam empowers us with methodology, with an intellectual framework. It gives us usul, it gives us principles, it gives us qawaid, it gives axioms. It gives us ways for us to truly think critically about everything we're going through. And all I think we're trying to explore in these journeys, because the whole idea of the meeting point is to explore, is to distill, is to synthesize and try to see, like, what are we looking at, and take that journey together. If you recall from the earlier sessions, this is all about taking a journey together. So like I know, as Yasir Fahmi, I know I can get very impassioned sometimes when I'm speaking. But that doesn't in any way, shape, or form necessitate that I'm speaking from a place of categorical truth. No, I'm presenting an opinion. And you remember, I multiple times I said I'm presenting my opinion now as Yasir Fahmi, right? Because especially when you start talking about politics, yeah, some of this is principled in the sense of, like, I may give some theological or spiritual or Qur'ani that's rooted in questions of, like, haqiqah, how your heart is aligned, attached, etc. But once I start talking about the particularities of national elections, local elections, etc., I'm giving my perspective, because I think, the nature of how charged the political discourse is, everyone acts as if they're speaking from a place of truth, right? And we're not realizing that how much subjectivity and relativism is a part of the discourse. So, if anything, I was just indicating, perhaps we can take the time to be a bit more critical and thoughtful about what we're being fed, what we're processing, how much of what I perceive or believe is a function of knowledge and ma'rifah, meaning that, like, I've really come to know something, or how much is a function of reaction to what I'm consuming. How much is a function of the role of identity politics, in our day and age, the with us against us kind of binary of black and white, because it's become. I mean, I believe now that between liberals and conservatives, it's become a very toxic, game of identity politics, right? You're with this group against that group, and Muslims, unfortunately, once again, in my opinion, have fallen in line with this charged binary. So, all I would advocate for, and maybe we can tease this out further, but I'll stop here just so I don't kind of eat up too much time. All I would is that we all take a step back, and we get out of the frenzied state of political discourse. I mean, really, everyone who's been talking about these particular national elections, they'll say the same thing. Like, when is this just going to be over? Because 2.5 years ago, or actually since the time Trump got elected, everyone has been talking about the next elections. And the election cycle starts earlier and earlier, the campaigning, the lobbying, who's going to run, who's not going to run. And I think the people who are, for the large part, exhausted are exhausted because I'm programmed to assume that I'm supposed to consume this stuff, layla nahar, night and day, for years on end, and to become categorically, like, just overwhelmed by that reality. I would want to challenge that as well. For example, why is it that I'm so personally exhausted? What have my practices, my consumption, my thought process, what does it look like that makes me come to this point? So a lot of, I hope, what we can explore as we're journeying to ma'rifah, to knowledge, is just what are the questions that we're supposed to be asking? How can we think more critically about these questions, for myself as Yasir Fahmi, for Shaykh Osamah, for Ustadh Zaied, and for everyone, inshallah ta'ala, who's listening.
So I'm actually just going to Go ahead, Sheikh Osamah.
I just might say something about I know when it comes to purely a purely political assessment, or a pure assessment of politics that's purely divorced from the discussion about values, it is a matter of perspective. But I would also caution that a lot of the perspectives that I personally heard from you, Maulana, are things that are rooted in our Islamic values. It's not just a issue of perspective where, any Muslim can choose to think whatever he'd like, but a lot of these perspectives are stemming from an understanding of our tradition. And I mean that seriously, because I really enjoyed what you had to say last week, and I could definitely see the correlations between the prophetic guidance and the teachings of our deen, and the way we should engage these things, because some aspects of it are matters of perspective, but others really, the bipartisanship of politics, everyone knows that it's not an issue of perspective anymore. That's just a downright toxicity. When you're talking about capitalizing on the plights of others, that's downright toxicity. That's not a matter of perspective. Everyone, who has any sense of an impartial assessment of what politicians on the national scale are doing, and some of the tragedies that are happening, can see this, and that from our religious perspective is very problematic, so I would say, that's what I would say. A lot of these things are not purely divorced from our values.
No, I don't, Maulana, I don't disagree with that. I don't disagree with the fact that there, at the end of the day, listen, you and I, we're mullahs, okay? We're shuyukh, okay? We have these, you have all those books behind you, right? We wear these kufis and these whatevers. And the fact that we're coming at this, as quote unquote mullahs, there is already a preconceived notion around shuyukh in terms of like social and political discourse, and the conception that shuyukh are always speaking from a position of categorical authority, and like these shuyukh, what do they know? They talk about everything and anything, and they think they know everything about everything. And listen, of course, a perspective, and I mean, as you can see, people, I'm very open about this stuff. There's a percentage of there's an element of what I'm saying that, yes, it's coming from a place of my study, Sheikh Osama's study, the time that we spent, in analyzing our Sharia and understanding fiqh and understanding usul, understanding Islamic law, legal theory, understanding Islamic philosophy, Islamic spirituality, and synthesizing these issues and trying to, really incorporate them into our lived reality, right? And not allow them to just exist within a vacuum. But we obviously are all, products of our environment and the world around us. So when I say that an element, of what I'm saying, yes, it's, if I'm talking about values and principles and ideals that are rooted in the Quran and the Sunnah, then yes, it carries a level of, I would say, quote unquote, authority. But when I'm, for example, talking about when Yasir Fahmy says something about like the significance of the national elections, right? The significance of the national elections, that's a perspective, right? That's why even the Prophet ﷺ, when they approached him, when he they would say, Ya Rasulullah, awahyun unzil, what was it, Maulana? Awahyun yunzil, aw shur al-ra'y wal-makida.
Yeah.
Like, is this a matter of revelation, Ya Rasulullah, or is this a matter of opinion? Okay. So there are elements of what especially when we start getting into issues like politics and the specifics of politics, right? Meaning, like, like I said, how significant are the national elections? How can Muslims build more influence and power? The role of local civic engagement. This is a matter of opinion. This is not a matter of wahi. This is a matter of opinion. And
absolutely. On that level, I completely agree.
Yeah. So I'm not trying to misrepresent Like, yeah, if I come, like when we start to talk about Islamic values and principles and ideals, matters of Sharia,
Or like the
matters of
question,
spirituality.
or the question, is it okay for someone in the name of engaging the political arena to sacrifice his values or her values? I think that's partially a religious discussion.
No, that's not partially. That's hugely a religious discussion, but that in and of itself is a conversation that's going to require, and this is why I'm a huge advocate of these issues. It requires shura, it requires counsel. It doesn't require one individual sheikh saying, this is categorically haram or this is categorically halal, because some of these issues and questions are complex, and they require a level of critical analysis, of nuanced perspective. One of our principles in Sharia, and this applies to multiple disciplines and sciences, is al-hukmu ala shay far'un an tasawwurihi. To be able to judge a matter is really an extension of having perspective on that matter, right? So, you know, being able to really assess what is it that I'm looking at. If you notice, if people really go back and listen to last session, a lot of what I'm trying to do is trying to understand, like, what am I looking at here? Okay. Like, as Yasir Fahmy / Shaykh Yasir Fahmy, I look at the political realm and I'm like, what's going on here? I'm just telling you honestly, as someone who was born and raised in this country, I didn't come, by the way, from some qarya. Like, I didn't come, like, I'm not someone who's like coming off the the range here. I'm someone who was born and raised in this country. I've been to university in this country. For all university students, I went to Rutgers. I worked in the corporate world. I worked in finance. I mean, I worked in Midtown Manhattan for 4 years. Like, so this world is not, I'm not like, what is politics? Hold on. Who's where? I have, a very lay person now, conception, and trying to apply my mind to think about what this stuff is. So a lot of my perspectives are more questions and critical questions than they are like categorical. That's why I'll never say something like, you shouldn't absolutely ever do this, and this is absolutely not that. I would say, no, like, for example, when I last time was talking about, this is like, our engagement with the political arena as it is matavwara. I use that word over, and then Zaied said extra, and there's a lot of exaggeration. Yeah, I personally stand by that. I think it's a very exaggerated enterprise. I mean, when I see that literally in the span of all of these years, the extent to which the average citizen, what they do in terms of political engagement, the average citizen, I'm not talking about, there are people who are far more intentionally involved. The average citizen, their entire civic engagement is watching endless news cycles, and then on one day casting a vote. And that makes me assume that I've done my civic duty. I would like to critically analyze that question, because I actually think there's a lot of a manipulation that happens. This is my personal perspective now. I think there's a lot of manipulation that happens to the common American citizen. That's why you see people so charged, so absolute, so black and white. Don't think, just watch, listen, images. There's propaganda. Okay, you like, there's entire genres that analyze media control and media influence, and how there's the use of psychological methods, like real, like psychological programming, to take people's minds and have them completely and categorically consumed by what they're watching, to then frame their truth, right? And making me feel like this is the truth. How do I know this is truth? Well, because I've been watching it on TV for 4 years. Really? Like, so now Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, these periodicals, they're the ones who are defining truth for me. Do I really trust that I can lend myself to them to convey to me what is and what is not? Right?
I really like that, Molana. Like, that you referred to that last time as political theater. And I really like that expression, and I think that's that's a discussion around values. Like when you say that, it just hit a chord with me. Like all those videos, even the past few days that I'm sure everyone's been watching. Like some supporters of Fulan blocking some highway, and some people getting into a physical altercation or a verbal altercation in this location or in that location. I think, like you said, that's all a product of the toxic political discourse that's coming from mass media, and I think that's a discussion around values.
So
I know Ustadh Zaid wants to say something.
I just before Zaied, I know you've been itching to get in. I'm sorry. I don't can I don't know. So I just want to say one thing. For me, the value, just so that I'm articulating what I like. So the value for me is liberating the mind and thinking very critically, thinking methodically, thinking with principles, with values. That really, when I look at Islamic scholarship, what it has done for the mind in terms of the sciences and the disciplines, like studying logic, studying usul and principles and axioms, etc. It really does begin to shape how you can, at the very least, ask very good questions, right? And to me, that is probably the biggest value. I would want, especially after this election is done, that we're able to sit down and really start to pose critical questions, because so much of the feedback that I read was people giving their perspective on what we should be doing, right? And I found that to be so interesting. It's like, I'm nowhere did I claim last time that we should, as Muslims, do X. I was more saying, like, I think we should consider, we should think, we should step back, we should really analyze, we should figure out how to build power, we should consider potentially a third party, right? I'm not really too personally convinced with this. So there's a lot of, like, now we can start to, like, if we're going to get into that conversation, then who comes to the table? Who do we bring to the table to have these conversations, right?
yeah.
Anyway,
I think the conversation is going in a very good direction, and it's leading into what my next question was going to be, but I don't want to skip over to that yet, because I still think your responses, and I say this with the utmost respect, I do think your responses kind of mixed issues a little bit, and I want to clarify some of the points, right? So there was a clear difference in my mind. There was a part of last episode where you were not saying it's an issue of perspective, right? This is an issue. I understood it more as an issue, in all honesty, that has to do more with aqidah, with our fundamental belief, right? That we don't look at any one of these as bad. We don't look at any one of these options to change, right? Allah has given us a slew of options in America that we can engage with to try to change the society for the better. This is one option among many. From an aqidah perspective, we're not going to make it bigger than it needs to be. We're not going to give it more power than it deserves, because at the end of the day, we recognize fully Allah is in charge. We recognize fully that Allah knows better than we do. And we're not going to buy into the language, regardless of who the candidates are, even if there were like very significant differences between the candidates. We're not going to put an undue amount of trust or an undue amount of expectation from this sabab. At the end of the day, the change is in the hands of Allah. We're going to do our best. So, because I think one of the terms that you I'm going to get a little bit more specific just so that I make sure that we hit this. At one point, you said something to the effect of, Biden or Trump, make a choice and move on, right? Yeah. And I think that was where people started to feel, in the midst of that conversation, was where people started to feel like, well, where are we now? Like we're saying that none of this matters. And I think that was a big misunderstanding. There was nowhere where I didn't get that you were saying, or Shaykh Osamah was saying, it doesn't matter at all. What I understood was you were saying, as a Muslim, we approach every single one of these opportunities that Allah gives us with a level of humility, and just a level of understanding that ultimately Allah knows what's best and He's going to be the one who makes the change. My job is to just do as best as I can. So I don't have to, like people, we were all seeing messages of people saying, I can't sleep. I can't believe that someone, I spoke to this person, I can't believe they're going to vote for the other candidate. It seems crazy to me. And there's no way in any world you can see what I'm seeing and come away with, the opinion that this other person is good and so on. And
Or that story you shared with us, Maulana, that person who told his mother, "You're no longer my mother," because she voted for one of the candidates.
Yeah, yeah. So I think so that issue is very different, I think, than some of the other issues that you were just talking about, which goes more into how do we now, which is my next question, like how do we actually use Islam?
Wait, someone told this. I'm sorry. Someone told his mother, "You're no longer my mother." Who is this guy?
It's not Muslim. Don't worry. It's not within the community.
Oh, okay. Get this guy out there.
But I'm saying, yeah, at a lesser level, yeah, we've seen Muslims do this all the time through social media. If you're voting for Fulan, defriend me right now. Or if you're involved with this party, then we have no relationship with each other. That's it. It's done. I don't want to have anything to do with you.
Or even if people aren't saying that, there is definitely a sense among many within the Muslim community, and definitely many within the country, that if one side or the other doesn't win, then 100% purely evil has won. Right?
Yeah, so exactly. I really think that's what Shaykh Yasir was just saying a few minutes ago, maybe in the midst of a whole bunch of other different things. But that's the way I understood the kalam. Of course, we don't mean that the person in charge or the person in the position of amana absolutely has no impact on our reality. We all realize that it's a position of public trust, because the effects of the decisions made at that level are very far-reaching. But I think what we were trying to caution is, political engagement, civic engagement has done so much more for the Muslim community than that political consumption through mass media has ever done. I'll even take it because it's very addicting. Even on a personal level, I felt this in the past few days. How many electoral votes does Fulan have? Just keep on going and check on social media. Oh, did it go up to 214, 213? Oh, is he going to get this state? Is he going to get that state? And just consumes your reality. And like you said, you even said this last time, that where's the Muslim involvement in local politics? So I guess more of like when you see it as means among means, and it's not like end all be all. And you actually realize that sometimes there are certain means that are far more effective, or have proven far more effective in terms of changing our reality, then hopefully the hope is that'll help calm people down a little bit. All right.
But again, I do want to. We're going to have a lot of pushback in this episode. So just everyone just needs to prepare.
Pushback is your middle name.
Yeah, I do want to. I do want to again push back here, right? I really understood the point to be divorced from whether or not you think the national elections are an effective way or not an effective way, or the most effective way or the least effective way, right? Because even if you believe fundamentally that even if you believe that the national elections are the most effective way for me to bring change, there still has to be a level of tempering, because at the end of the day, and I spoke about this in last week's khutbah, like at the end of the day, the Prophet ﷺ went around, he did everything, he used every means Allah gave him, he didn't know when, where, and how Allah was going to bring him his support and his ultimate victory, and how the hearts were going to be opened. Allah gave him doors to knock on, he knocked on those doors. And eventually Allah brought it from somewhere he didn't expect. And Allah says this explicitly in the Quran. So even if, someone who's listening now believes that the national election is the most important, right, the biggest way for us to impact change, what we said doesn't change.
Yeah.
Right? Like you still have to temper the way that you're going to deal with that sabab. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. You need to temper it, even though I think that's a big, even if, I think I would have massive pushback on that point. If a person really thinks that the national elections are the most effective way to change the reality, I think that's that's stemming from a lack of awareness of how the Prophet ﷺ brought about change in the lives of the companions. I think that would be for another episode. But, do laws and policies change society? I think that's a huge question to ask. And from my understanding of the Seerah, I would say that is definitely not the entry point to change from an Islamic philosophical perspective. It's definitely not the entry point. It's the entry point to change that we learned from the Meccan period is one that starts from reform from within. So it doesn't start with politicians. It starts with a very spiritual approach, one stemming from values, character, belief, attitude towards life, and so on and so forth. So anyway, I know I'll let Shaykh Yasir get in. I know he has some gems to give us.
No, I mean, honestly, I think you guys have covered a lot of what he need to be. I mean, I think Zaid is Jazakallah khair for just making sure that we're kind of like, distilling each point into its own um space. So the theological question, I mean, that to me is categorical. I don't have any. This is not a question that's left up to for debate or the question of la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah wa hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakil. That's a categorical theological truth, whether we like it or not, whether we accept it or not, whether we agree with it or not, because Allahu al-haq. So the idea that Allah is sufficient for me and he is the best of those to be relied upon, and there is no court, there is no power, there is no power, no might, no recourse except by and through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is a fundamental truth, and every single other existing thing is contingent. It's something that's jaiz, it's something that may or may not be, something that has all sorts of possibilities attached to it. So as Zaid noted, I mean, we utilize the means that are in front of us. So when I very dismissively said Trump or Biden, coffee, tea, whatever, I was saying that in the vein of really don't overthink what this may or may not mean in the most existential sense, right? And even from the practical sense of like political engagement, I would then personally, as Yasir Fahmi, challenge how critically vital one or the other is, right? I would challenge that personally. I would now personally challenge that. And that's something that's why I'd say it's left up for debate. So that element of like how critical are national elections, how critical are local elections, how critical are federal elections, all these are questions that we can discuss. But I also want to caution the fact that the modern system as it is right now, with politics and media and propaganda, has made it where we are so consumed by these questions as if this is our reality, right? And brothers and sisters, the fact of the matter is that the day-to-day of our lives, the choices that we make and how we live, that especially as Muslims who live in the United States, the door is open for us to be, engaged in the broadest sense of that word all the time, every single day. And if you recall from last week, we spoke about the spiritual, theological, and religious imperative to be someone who is engaged, right? And by engaged, I don't mean purely in the political discourse. I mean social. I mean waking up every day and thinking to myself, how am I going to benefit people? The point that Shaykh Osamah noted about spiritual reform, meaning if I really care about people, and I really care about the disenfranchised, I really care about values and morals in society, how much of that is representative in my life? Like I can't have like a duality playing out where my life, I lead it in a very particular way. Perhaps it's self-centered, perhaps self-indulgent. I do what I want to do. I live my life. I'm consumed by my career, my ideas of self, all this. And then when I go and I cast a vote, I say, yeah, I'm voting because of all these profound morals and ideals and values that when I look into my day-to-day life, maybe I don't see those, right? And this is where I think we can do a lot of more proactive and productive work to ensure that we're just being thoughtful and critical about what we're doing. Unfortunately, once again, I don't see that people are asking a lot of questions in general. I think people have their assumptions and they're like literally in the left lane going 120 miles per hour, right? And it's all built on assumptions, subjectivities, relativism, right? and being like these, someone to say to his mom, you're no longer my mother because you voted for that candidate. This is insane. That's insanity. That's an insane statement to make. Okay. Some of you may think, no, it's not, because that person is so identifiably evil. Anyone who, whatever. Okay, what do we do with 70 plus million Americans who voted for the other candidate, right? Are they all evil, misguided, shayateen, right? This is that's it's just that type of absolutism that's borderline like fascistic in its nature. That's going to destroy us as a nation. It is. Like, it's going to destroy us as people if we view the other as the evil other. Like, are we not feeding into the same narrative and the same discourse that has plagued the Muslim community, as creating the category of the other, otherizing people? Every other person is evil, right? I'm not saying that, one candidate or the other's actions are not identifiably qabih, just ugly. You see filthy behavior, language, speech, etc. But when you talk about citizenry, when you talk about human beings, people who follow one or the other, the Prophet ﷺ, he loved people. He loved people, and he loved the hidayah of people. And he went to the nth degree to embrace people, to show people a better way, right? To have them consider the possibility of what could be or could not be. That his spirit was beautiful, it was humble, it was modest, it was merciful. Because of the nature of the modern discourse around politics, stripped of mercy, stripped of compassion, stripped of humility. It is unfortunately riddled with aggression, arrogance, bluntness, fascism, in my opinion, on both sides, right? Meaning that it's like categorical, and the other side is X and I am Y. I mean, you talk about the potential of serious infighting between the citizenry. Yeah, if we don't all take a step back and realize, that we're being led into, the slaughterhouse because we're not using our minds to take a step back and say, like, really, why am I so charged by this? Why am I so aggressive about this point? Like, what opinions have I absorbed that make me feel so aggressively, absolutely categorical about this opinion that I have? When at the end of the day, I'm sorry, it's just an opinion. Like, a person favoring Biden over Trump or Trump over Biden is an opinion. It's not truth. It's not haq. Allahu al-haq. Allahu al-haq. Right?
So, Maulana, what if someone was to say to you for that? Like, so are you telling me that the Prophet ﷺ would embrace racism? Yani, is that what you're telling us to do? Like, embrace racism, embrace racists, embrace people who are,
No.
Marginalizing minorities and stuff like that. So that's, I think, speaking on their tongue, I think that's
Good.
what they would probably
No, this is
say.
good. Listen, anyone who says embrace racism, embrace fascism, embrace ugliness, yeah, of course, that obviously contradicts the Islamic framework. My point is about not the person; it's about the people, right? It's about understanding why people make the decisions. Like, really, yeah, ahbab. Like, I feel like sometimes we don't. We when it comes to me, as in any of you who are listening, right? We all make mistakes, right? We all are stumbling on the path of life. Now, if all of us, we are pained by the fact that there are people in our lives, some uncle or some auntie or some friend or some person or some mullah or whoever, who comes and is aggressive with me. They saw me dressing a certain way or doing a certain thing, and they write me off. They judge me. They attack me. They don't whatever. We complain about that. All I'm advocating for is let's dig deeper into our humanity and realize and understand and ask the question: why are people like? Ask yourself, why would 70 plus a million Americans vote for one candidate over the other? Why?
Yeah.
What are the motives? It's not a question of like, oh, see, immediately, oh, you're capitulating to evil. Okay, if me asking a question that is a human question, trying to understand where a person is coming from, right? Because I love my I love my fellow citizenry. I love, see, as a now from a prophetic disposition, I have to love people. I have to care about people. I have to care about people's hidayah, right? And for me to care about people's hidayah and care about people's wellness, I have to understand why people are coming from where they're coming from. Like, is it really every person who voted for a candidate categorically evil? Like they are, rapist, narcissistic, fascistic, whatever, capitulating with racism and evil, or as people who are operating from a place of confusion, fear, whatever, and vice versa. Anyone who's voting for Biden, the same thing. I would say, I honestly, I would ask the questions on both sides. I would challenge all of us, right, to ask the question, why did we vote for this person? This is what I mean, going back to values and principles, right? I'm sorry for taking up space, but please give me a moment here. The idea of what are the governing principles and values that compel me to vote for this candidate over that candidate, right? What are the identifiable values that I am coming from? Like, what's my starting point, right? To think about this person being good versus this person being bad, right? Because everyone has said this. There's like there's a lot of there's plenty of qubh to go around, right? There's a lot of ugliness to go around in the political atmosphere. Unfortunately, I think many have the agreement that the political system has been broken. The credibility of the political realm, the political establishment, how the party politics has been operating, all of it. There's a lot of problems to go around. Okay. So as a Muslim today, or as just an average citizen, what are the morals, the values that I'm truly advocating for? What am I prioritizing and why? Why does this person clearly represent more of my value system than this person? On what terms and what grounds? Those are the questions I want to challenge. All I'm saying is ask more critical questions. Try to have tasawwur. Really look at what you're, before you pass a judgment now on people in general. Ask, why are people voting this way? What's their motivation? Perhaps they're far more concerned about this value over that value. You're saying, I am voting for this person on these values. People may be voting against that person on these values, right? So it's like, and we don't want to have that conversation. We just want itlaqat, absolute tropes. He's evil, he's good, he's good, he's evil. Anyone who votes for that person is evil. Anyone who votes for this person is evil. And it's happening on both sides. And like, this is where things become, honestly, this is when we really go back to al-jahiliyatul ula, right? It's like, أنا ابن عمي ضد عدوي, like me and my cousin versus my enemies, right? انصر أخاك ظالما أو مظلوما, like, going back to now, not with the prophetic description of that statement, but like the old one, like, I bring victory to my people, whether they are oppressed or oppressors, doesn't matter, right? Because we are the virtuous, we are the correct, we are on the haqq. Yeah. This stuff, this is the stuff that I categorize as being non-prophetic and like the whole idea of the meeting point is the journey of Sayyiduna Musa to go on a path to find wisdom, to find the one who has more knowledge, to learn from, etc. And this is like the essential journey of the Muslim has to be that. Allahu
Jazakallah khairan, Mawlana. It's very eloquent and very deep. I like how you put it, so it's not, it's more of negotiating our response. It's not that in absolutes, it's not that, if you are a compassionate human being and you deal with people in a very caring way, that you are going to be embracing racism necessarily. No, the Prophet ﷺ dealt with the likes of Abu Jahl, Abu Lahab, and said to them, Ya qawmi. There's a certain, so negotiating the response and not dealing with it in a very absolutist way. And I really like that in your words. And, I think that question of like, why are people voting for who they're voting, like you said, and everyone recognizes that the political system is broken. I really think that many people can see how that contributed to our reality for the past 4 years to begin with. That many people, when they vote for Fulan or Ilan, they're not voting because of his racist comments, because of his bigoted statements, because of his perspective on certain issues, but more of it's they have lost hope in the political system. And this seems to be the only thing that is foreign to the political system that could possibly change their reality. I think it's a deep thing to discuss and everything like that. But I really liked those words. Jazakallah khair, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us do that.
So this is guiding us into one of the other questions I wanted to ask, and it's a question that I think is going to take a very long time, and it leads us into a very wide discussion. Before I ask the question, I just want to reiterate something Shaykh Yasir said, so that no one misunderstands when we get into the question what we're talking about, right? Shaykh Osamah also just said it, but I do want to repeat it again. There's a huge difference from my understanding. The Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam consistently always left the door open for people to redeem themselves. He left the door, he loved his people all the way to the point that those who were willing to assassinate him, the Prophet ﷺ was making dua for them. The Prophet ﷺ was trying to bring them back always. He was never in a place of writing off even the likes of Abu Jahl or Umar ibn al-Khattab, who was a very strong opponent of the Prophet in the early years. Yeah. And so leaving the door and your heart open to people is prophetic. Leaving the door and your heart open to evil is not, right? So the Prophet never stopped saying that tribalism is a problem, that oppressing people is a problem. It's fadl Shaykhi.
Yeah, like you're saying, standing up for truth.
Yeah. So while he pushed against the evil, he always left the door open for people to redeem themselves, because it wasn't an issue of victory over people. It was an issue of guiding people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from a position of love. That's a very powerful point. Right. Now, but this does guide me to my
because
my
I think the point the point that you just mentioned about it not being a victory over people, but it's a question of guidance. That is, I think, if everyone, Jazakallah khair, Ustadh Zaied, if everyone can take that, this is not a game. And this is a part of, I think, the disease of the process. Everyone's turned it into a game. Yeah. It's a part of like qahr, me winning over them and them winning over us. No one wins in that space. But when it's a question of hidayah, a question of guidance, a question of mercy, a question of compassion, a question that's coming from a deep place of adl, right, and ihsan. In Allah ya'muru bil adli wal ihsan. Then reality shift and change, right? And that's something I think just to think about. Anyway, go back, Zaied. Sorry.
Yeah, it shouldn't be, like you said, just to add to that, like not a reactionary response, like, someone who doesn't act humanely doesn't deserve to be treated as a human. That's not a prophetic disposition where, they're marginalizing us, we're going to do everything in our power to marginalize them. This us them reality, they responded with this, we're going to respond with something even tougher. Like you said, I think that's part of the toxicity. I think I even heard someone wrote this. I don't remember who, to be honest with you. But like when we said, when in the midst of that person's reflection on the elections, it was like, I don't want to ever hear anyone say this is not who we are, because clearly this is half of the country who it really is. It's like a very large, vast generalization of, okay, we have 70 million racists in this country, bigots, and they're all, mash'arif, and this is who we are as a nation, and so on and so forth.
And that's so interesting. I'm sorry, Zaied, I know you want to.
No, go ahead.
But that's so interesting because the fact that somehow we are now defining who we are based on some of the categories that are presented to us in media, right? In media, about what is and what is not, what should be, what shouldn't be, and who we are, like essentially as people. If we're gonna riddle ourselves down to who we are based on some very superficial political discourse, then we have, as human beings, a serious problem in our hands, right? Because we're not going to come out good from this. if this is how we're going to start to define ourselves.
But this is where my question comes in. I was going to, originally my thought was to avoid the specifics of the two candidates, but you guys, our shuyukh have already opened that door. So I'm going to use them as the opening, as how we're going to enter into this conversation. All right. There is a massive challenge that Muslims in America have. And I'm going to say this frankly, not out of disrespect for Shaykh Yasir or Shaykh Osamah, who are from the scholarly class, but just as a frank sort of point. One of my frustrations over the last several years with my beloved mashayikh has been that quite often it's obvious that the community at large is deeply struggling with how to make these, how to weigh the different values and the different issues that are coming at them. Not just politically, by the way. For a lot of people in different professions, this is a big issue because we're in a secular society where the values are so vast, the starting point of values in a secular society are so different from the starting point for Islam, right? And the hierarchy of values is very different. And so quite often Muslims ask this question, like, how and when do I make this decision, all right? And so now when we get into the political realm, right, there is a lot in this election that like it's a mixed bag, right? On either side, you can find things that you would argue for, that may more or less like this policy position of this candidate tends to agree more with my value system but with this other candidate, he has a part or he has an issue that, he does better with certain values than I do. And I think Muslims are really struggling with, how do I now engage politically? If I'm going to engage politically, how do I draw conclusions on what is the greater maslahah? What's the greater good, right? And most Muslims they're not going to be scholars of usul. They're not going to be scholars of maqasid, right? They're not going to be scholars of like the axioms of jurisprudence. They're not going to be scholars on the general goals of the Sharia. These they're not engaged in this process, right? I don't know what guidance we can give them, and I'm going to use the candidates and then one other issue that was on the ballot this election to highlight this point. So when it comes to what you were just discussing about, like, this isn't about who we are, right? I can see an argument for people to say, no, I disagree deeply, because there's a lot of stuff that one candidate in particular has done and said explicitly and outrightly. Even if you want to argue that both candidates in secret are the same, fine, but explicitly and outrightly, one candidate has said and done things that goes against even what some people would determine to be very big Islamic values. Things like racism, things like tribalism in the broader sense, right? Like, you're either with me or against me, and if you're with me, everything you say and do is amazing, and if you're against me, everything you say and do is a lie and disgusting and deceitful, right? And if you're from this ethnic group or this racial group, then you're naturally not one of us, right? There's one candidate who's playing up racial tensions on purpose, it seems, right? And it's only one candidate, just to be fair and blunt, right? You may have criticisms of both, but it really is only one candidate. So when people say, like, this is an issue of not like, is this who we really want to be as a country? Or if a Muslim comes and says, I can't believe that you're voting for that person, I don't know that they're always saying that you for voting for him is a racist. They're saying, I don't understand as a Muslim, for example, or as an American even, I can't compute how you're putting other values above that value, right?
Okay, I mean,
I'm just going to draw out the other points so that I'm very clear, so we don't get like lost in the weeds. The other issue that was on the ballot in a lot of states was the issue of weed legalization, right? And I had this conversation with a lot of Muslims who were arguing that we should vote for weed to be legalized because the criminalization of weed has been weaponized against Black communities and has been used to oppress them, right? To me, now I'm going to put myself out there a little bit just to make the point clear. What am I trying to ask? To me, I couldn't come to that point. There was no way I could jump to that. Weed is haram, as far as I know. I don't know of any scholar who's going to tell me weed is not haram because it disrupts the mind and all that, right? How am I going to stand in front of Allah and vote and say that I voted to make something haram more accessible to people when it was not accessible to them? It seems to me, oh yes, I agree with you. This is oppressive. We should stop the oppression, right? But to me, in my judging, no, this is a layer. This is an area of Islam I can't go into. It's not gray, right? Something that is haram is already illegal. I'm not going to push to make it legal. But a lot of the Muslims are saying, no, the oppression of people is a much bigger issue. The fact that it's being weaponized as a source of oppression, that's much bigger than someone now going and smoking weed. So I'm going to vote against that, right? And so the challenge that we're having is I don't know that Muslims in America have a good sense how to weigh these things. And I don't know if there's any advice you can give or you feel comfortable giving in that, like on that question.
So Jazakallah kull khair. I mean, there's a lot to unpack here. The first point is as follows in my mind. Number one, it's embracing the fact that we are humble beings, and our capacity to really conceive of all of truth is obviously extremely limited. So as human beings in general, we operate from a place of deep humility, and we walk with, عِبَادُ الرَّحْمَنِ الَّذِينَ يَمْشُونَ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ هَوْنًا, right? So we walk gently, we absorb, we try to understand. Now, I'm looking at a situation. I have two candidates, right? And I see, as I understand good and bad, I understand my value system, right? To the extent that I understand it, or what I understand to be, a principled stance, I really cannot fathom that this person should be voted for. So I'm going to vote for this person. Okay, you made that decision. Khair, alhamdulillah. Like, that's khair. I don't see a person doing that as being evil or faulty or broken. You don't need all of usul and all of maqasid and all of these qawaid to say, based on how I perceive things, right? I believe, I should vote for this person. And you're saying, because of this value and that value and this issue and this problem, I can't fathom to vote for anyone else but the other person, even if the other person has issues as well.
Yeah.
Bismillah. I think I said this last time. I said this time. Bismillah, make your vote. Like, that's not the issue I have. Okay. And the only addition that I would add to that is say, every human being now can ask themselves, like, maybe perhaps a very productive question for me to pose to people and shuyukh and elders and whoever, is to say, well, what are my values? Like, what are our value system? Because like, the lion's share of when we speak about values and principles and morals is also coming from within the political sphere. It's becoming from within the political platforms, who are articulating values and morals and principles and saying, this is what is good and this is what is bad. This is a greater evil, this is a lesser evil. Unfortunately, a lot of that language is also coming in from the political space. I think as Muslimin, we should take ownership of that question, right? Yes, racism is haram and it's evil and it's ugly. Tribalism is ugly. Narcissism is ugly. Harming disenfranchised and weak and vulnerable people is ugly. Oppression is ugly. But brothers and sisters, any cursory read of American history, whether it's been Democrats or Republicans, there has been a lot of harm that's been spread. Okay, there has been a lot of undue murder of innocent people across the world, right? By both Democrats and Republicans. A lot of people have been dealt with unjustly from our political system, from our country, right? The US, right? Countless innocent lives, right? So it's just a matter of thinking, like, not being so drawn into what's being said to me about, the clear choice that you have right now that you have to make. It's just, let me just take a moment to process this and think. And then at the end of the day, when you make a decision, you're saying, Ya Allah, oh Allah, guide me. Oh Allah, forgive me. Yes. Oh Allah, guide me, because I do not know and I need your guidance. This is a sabab, a means that came into my life. It seems that the proactive thing to do is to take a stand, to cast my vote. I seek your forgiveness, Ya Allah, for my misguidance. I seek your forgiveness if I have done something that is inappropriate or wrong.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, a very measured, a humble, proactive approach to dealing with these questions. You don't, like, we're not going to come to, like someone was saying, this idea of coming back to the table, building a council of individuals, theorizing, platforms, whatever. The Muslims have never been organized. When can we assume that the Muslims are ever going to do something productive like that? Fair. That's a very fair statement, but that does not necessitate that in the process, I have to clearly, like, people, we have been made to be convinced that I have to fall in line with the Democrats or I have to fall in line with the Republicans, as if it's almost like a type of an obligation, because outside of that, you're quote unquote irrelevant. I would personally push back on that idea, right? I would personally push back on that idea. I would say, why? Who said that? Right? On what grounds? In what terms? So you cast your vote. Alhamdulillah. May Allah accept. I hope there's sincerity in casting your vote. And inshallah, you casting your vote, you're trying to do it in a means of like being responsible in some capacity. Great. But I would say, everyone who casts their vote, نسأل الله الهداية ونسأل الله المغفرة. Al-maghfirah, why forgiveness? People say, oh, did I do something haram? No. It's good to seek forgiveness. Prophet ﷺ would seek forgiveness every day. And these complicated decisions, right, that are convoluted and messy, perhaps I'm touching something that's not clean in that process. So I seek, Ya Allah, your forgiveness. What's wrong? Like that's an objectively good moral approach to dealing with my circumstances, doing it with humility, having conversations, like not having shouting matches, not aggressing, having conversations thoughtfully and calmly. This is how we progress, I think, constructively and productively.
So
I want to push a little bit on this issue. I know Shaykh Osamah is trying to get in. This
was a really deep question, barakallahu feek. I really wanted to just add to it, because I know it's a really long question. I think one of the important things to please keep in mind as you're listening to the meeting point is this is a very long discussion. And because it's so long, you may have missed out on some of the things that were discussed earlier. If you didn't hear this session from the beginning, I suggest to perhaps listen to it from the beginning and to get the full understanding of what we're really trying to get at. I definitely, Jazakallah khair for bringing this to the forefront, because I don't think any of us were suggesting that there's a quick fix for this problem or for this reality of ours, dealing with political engagement and how to effectively do that and really bring change to society. I don't think there's a quick fix for it on one end. And also on the other end, none of us were suggesting that, there's like somehow it's fair game to vote for whoever without consequence, and even if you vote, we weren't suggesting that Muslims should go vote for fulan or fulan. That's not, absolutely, we weren't equating them, like how can you go vote for someone who said this or did that? We didn't get in that discussion. So we realized there's no quick fix, and we realize that most Muslims are not fuqaha and they're not ulama and mashayikh that have fiqh principles in their mind. And we realize that there is a long-term goal to be had here for the Muslim community in developing a more effective engagement of the political arena. I think that's one. The other thing about the question is, I really think it goes back to perspectives on where real reform stems from. How could you vote for someone who does this or does that? Is ultimately, whether you vote for fulan or fulan, is that what really changes society? Is it somehow an Islamic, and I think this is an important thing to be said, is it somehow an entirely Islamically inappropriate response to be a person who simply can't decide on one of the issues of the ballot? I personally think that's not the case. If someone is really confused because there's just so many things in terms of conflicting, they have so much internal conflict in terms of the values that are being projected by both sides of the two dominant political forces, and they can't decide. I don't think that you're any less, I don't think you've forsaken the Muslim community if you don't vote for a certain candidate. And I think that's important to keep in mind. I don't think you've forsaken the Muslim community if on one of the issues on the ballot, you simply can't decide and you'd rather not decide because you don't want to be pulled into the questioning before Allah Azza wa Jal of aiding this opinion or that opinion. I think in the end of the day, what we're trying to get at is more of, a holistic attitude towards the, even that issue that you mentioned about weed and legalizing marijuana. It was actually presented to me in the past few days from the opposite perspective, that, Muslims need to go out and vote because one of the issues on the ballot is legalizing marijuana. And if we don't vote against this, legalizing marijuana, Allah's going to ask us, why have you allowed marijuana to be legalized in your area and you didn't stand up against it? I think many communities actually take it from that standpoint and they don't realize the perspective you introduced. اللي هو, legalizing it or not legalizing it, that in the end of the day, that decision isn't going to reform the nufus. If it's not legalized, it doesn't mean that marijuana is somehow not going to find its way into, the lives of millions of people in our country. Saying it's not let me just finish this point here. It's a big issue. So it's not a black and white thing, like you said. From that standpoint, the issue with legalizing marijuana from an Islamic perspective, many people are saying is it's so that people aren't wrongfully convicted or don't end up in the system, and it ends up becoming this vicious cycle where they can never find a way to get their life together because they're a convicted criminal and they cannot get a job and they're targeted by the prison industrial complex because of their mistake that they've made. So it's a very involved issue. It's not an issue of binaries, but I can choose as a Muslim to say, well, you know what, I have a difficult time supporting the legalizing of something that really, really, in my opinion, is detrimental to the condition of society. But it's not a black and white thing, I really think that's what a part of the halaqah is trying to get at. Wallah alam. Tafadhal, Mawlana. Sorry, but I cut you off.
No, I was interjecting. So I appreciate everything, both Shaykh Yasir and Shaykh Osamah, everything you guys both said. I do want to reiterate something though, right? Like we've already established in our first conversation, right? And again in this conversation, that engagement in the broadest terms is an important ibadah, it's an important form of worship, and specifically that engaging politically, even locally, and especially locally, we said last time, is a door that Allah has left open to us that is good to engage with if you're able to. Now, I appreciate your point 100%, Shaykh Osamah, where you say if someone is not clear on something, right, there's no wrong in them saying, I don't know enough, I'm just going to put my hands up and leave it to Allah, right? But I still come back to, what was that, Shaykh? You're muted.
Maulana, I'm happy you agree, but I'm going to say again, a lot of the rhetoric that's coming out of our Muslim community, if you don't do this, you're a traitor to the Muslim community. If you don't go out and vote for Fulan, you've betrayed us.
So again, but this is why, and I'm gonna re-ask the question, then I'm gonna give you guys an out, right? Very comfortable out, because I know it's not an easy question.
No. By the way, I'm sitting here quietly. I don't want an out. Ask your questions. Like what? We have this conversation. Let's have this conversation.
Here's the thing. Again,
we shouldn't fear. Can I just say something? Yeah. We shouldn't fear conversation. I don't know. The Muslim community has become so brittle and fragile. Doesn't know how to have a complex conversation. Not you.
Yeah, but
not you. I'm not talking about. I know you're coming from a place of rahmah. You don't want to burden us or whatever. No, I want to put this out there. Let's have these conversations. Let's talk about all the complex issue, all the sensitive issues. If we don't, wallahi, brothers and sisters, if we don't learn to have thoughtful, calm, meaningful conversations, really we're destined to an unfortunate place, right? Because the rhetoric is becoming so charged and so absolute. I am certain that there's people who's already written some of us off because we're not as charged or whatever about their specific opinion. but to be a calming presence and to try to like really bring places to a place. Let me hear what you're saying. I think this is an essential part of our journey on this path. So sorry, Zay, go back.
Yeah. So again, I'm gonna ask the question again. I appreciate everything you said about it, starting from a point of humility and a point of istighfar and recognizing that I may not have the right answer. I'm just doing my best. I also appreciate the fact that you started off by saying, make your judgment call and try to be sincere and go ahead, right? I'm going to reiterate the question because my question was more specific than that, right?
Okay.
The question is, how? Like, what are the values? How does one prioritize the values of Islam, right? When looking at these things, because that's where a lot of this stuff gets dicey for people, right? So let me take it away from the election, because it's actually a way more charged issue than weed is, in my opinion, right? So I'll stick with the weed question, right? How is a Muslim, like, what are the prioritize, like, how does a Muslim prioritize those different values, right? And how does a Muslim, at what level or to what extent does the reality on the ground, overpower or overwhelm or outweigh a value, right? So if weed is categorically haram, right, but someone comes and says, yeah, so is oppression, and there's really not much of a means for me to push back against the cops misusing this, or the system misusing this against a young person of color, right? So I don't really have those means, so I'd rather just cut them off at the stem, right? I don't want to give them the chance to get far enough, right? Because I'm not going to be able to push back against the justice system yet. So at what points do these different issues, like, how do we prioritize them? So I'm just going to stick with the weed question to make it a little bit easier for us so we don't get too philosophical, right? So you have the issue of it being a substance that messes with your mind. Naturally, it's not something that's halal. You have the issue of the oppression, right? You have the issue of the whole system that is built on the back of this thing, right? And not just the issue of weed, but so many laws in our country eventually feed into this prison industrial concept, right? Are we just going to make everything legal, right? Like, how do we prioritize these different values? And this extends way beyond the weed question. I'm just sticking it to weed because it's a very, like, surprisingly, I think it's a less charged issue than most other issues, and it might be easier for us to discuss it. So we get into some specifics, but I have family members who are engaged with the mental health community, and this is a question that comes up all the time. This isn't a political issue, just right. So even with the mental health community, they'll ask questions like this all the time. How do I value, like, where do I put a person's, like, mental health versus what I believe to be more righteous, and so on and so forth? And we haven't gotten a lot of guidance from our scholars on how to prioritize these values. And that's the question that I'm asking.
Yeah. I mean, listen, I think to give this particular issue, or any particular issue like this one, its due right, it's going to require a proper sit down. It just is, like, because any cooked, number one, like, I think people have spoken about marijuana, spoken about weed. People know, for example, weed is prohibited, weed is something you shouldn't do, people, whatever, like, in terms of just general practice. I think it becomes far more complicated for people to speak on and speak about it with, like, categorical nature, when it becomes a question around the civic society. It comes around the question of legislation, dealing with the political dimensions of this question, dealing with the social ramifications, dealing with the legal implications. Like, it is complex. Like, I'll give you an example. Before New Jersey, Massachusetts, here, this was on the bill last time, and before the voting was going to happen, I was pulled into a meeting by the interfaith community here, who brought in very high level governmental officials from across the country, who spent the past I don't know how many years since it was legalized in Oregon, to explain to us the full spectrum of the implications, right, of the legalization movement in the United States, right? And I sat there for 3 hours listening between senators, congressmen, lawyers, elected officials, who were distilling in like 1,000 PowerPoint slides every single, like, so much, I don't want to say every single, I want to be categorical, so much of what the implications and what the spectrum and how this manifests into existence. And I sat there like, you know, with my eyes open, with my tongue stunk out, like, wow, okay, there is a lot going on here. I'll give you some of the highlights that just to put in your mind, just to consider, right? The question of criminalization, the question of decriminalization versus legalization is a big question, right? Because in the Massachusetts, for example, marijuana has already been decriminalized, right? It was already decriminalized, meaning that it doesn't carry as much criminal weight as it did, you know, in the 90s and the early 2000s. So you come today, right? And it's like, okay, well, if it's already been decriminalized and the legal system has already, then what's this movement towards legalization? And you know, why has it become suddenly such an evident question that everyone is meant to negotiate? Like, what happened over the past few years in this country that made it where the legalization of marijuana is an evident movement that everyone has to morally weigh in on? No, big part of the legalization movement is big, marijuana business. There has been hundreds of millions of dollars that have been pumped into through lobbies to make this an issue on the ballot, right? The profiteering that is happening from marijuana is exorbitant, right? We went through the endless products, the product lines. Right now in Massachusetts, you can go to distilleries and see the products that you can purchase, right? The way in which CBD is synthesized into it's plugged into so many products. You have, like, instead of a Klondike bar, you have a Krondike bar, right? You know, the targeted marketing to children, the entire media apparatus now, beyond normalizing the idea of the culture of smoking weed, because it's a weed culture. So you look at Joe Rogan celebrating, the idea of the weed culture, and it becomes like, it's like, what's wrong with you, like obtuse, uptight people who have a problem with this? Look at it. We're just relaxing. We're having a great time. And on top of that, look at the added benefit is that there are a lot of disenfranchised people in the prison industrial complex who've been affected by, the criminalization of weed. So it's an obvious choice. It should be clearly legalized because the benefits outweigh the harm when you clearly legalize it. And on the conversely, as Shaykh Osamah was saying, there are those who are saying categorically, you have to vote X. And if you don't, it's a religious obligation. If you don't, you've derelicted on your religious obligation or duty. This is where we lose so much nuance, so many people, right? Understanding what the issues are, it actually requires a lot of processing. It takes a lot of time. That's why I completely agree with what Shaykh Osamah said. Okay, tawaqquf is a valid religious, stance to say, this is something I don't fully process or understand, so I'm not going to weigh in on it. That's a very valid position. I don't think anyone should be faulted for a valid position like that, right? And anyone who decides to say categorically this is what we should do without actually having spent the time understanding the particularities, right, of how this manifests economically, how it manifests socially. Like, for example, in Oregon, the studies that have been done to show the direct correlation between, and these studies are already published, the direct correlation between youth poverty, okay, and youth disenfranchisement and the legalization of marijuana, it's like this, right? So you go to Oregon, you go to many parts of the West Coast where it's been legalized for many years, you see the destruction of the lives of many people who are like coming there and living just so that they can have access to marijuana. The studies that have been done about marijuana being a gateway drug to harsher drugs, also, these are studies that are actually produced, and I don't have them off the top of my head, but we analyzed these studies, we saw them over a 3-hour presentation. But even with that, even with my 3-hour presentation, and this was a room that was full of high-level government officials, as well as like experts in this space, I'm looking at all this, I'm saying, wow, like just really wow, how this permeates so many aspects of our lives, socially, economically, obviously legally. Yes, a big part of this for me, for example, is also seeing, someone who is carrying a baggie or having like a certain ounce of weed is now like in prison for 20 years. That's dhulm, that's ugliness. How do you rectify for that? How do you address that question? So sometimes, sometimes, and once again, I'm going to go back to the principle that I articulated. Sometimes you're going to say, at my level, based on what I think, Bismillah, I'm going to make this decision, right? And Rabbina, guide me and forgive me. Guide me and forgive me, right? I may tawaqquf, and maybe I don't do anything. It may be that I ask some mashayikh and some teachers and some elders and some, people of knowledge and understand, like, what do you think is the best thing? And then make my decision. And very often, brothers and sisters, we're not going to come to the best possible point, because people always push back and they say, like, when are we going to do all these profound things you're talking about? Yeah, that's the ideal. We can never get rid of the ideal, right? The ideal is that we have these spaces and these shura bodies that are comprised of mashayikh, that are comprised of lawyers, politicians, historians, constitutional experts, people congregating to have these, because these are complicated questions. Like the political process in the US is a complicated process, right? And it is very nuanced. So I don't expect the average American citizen to have all the wealth of knowledge that is required to make a decision. But what I can say on principle is just be very, very humble, right? And if you choose to abstain, alhamdulillah. If you choose to weigh in, just make sure that when you press vote, that you have done your personal due diligence. فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ. Like, yes, when it comes to the question of pressing vote, like, yes, on legalizing something like marijuana or anything that may be prohibited in Islam, a part of the repertoire of people that you ask, yes, you should certainly ask a sheikh, a religious scholar, someone who is grounded, because you're not factoring in their opinion. I think you're doing something that's you're going on shaky grounds, right? If you don't factor in, I'm not saying you have all knowledge. Listen, the marijuana bill, the marijuana question, like after those presentations and then subsequent other gatherings, I'm like, wow, this is a really complex thing. Now, at the end of the day, right? In my opinion, the harms clearly outweighed the benefits. This is my opinion now as Yasir Fahmy. When I looked at all this stuff, like, yes, at the end of the day, even in Massachusetts, I was like, yeah, the harms of this issue clearly permeate so many levels of society, right? Then the evident benefits, especially when in Massachusetts, it's already been decriminalized, right? So I'm like, okay, I think the balance is clear on this one.
Yeah.
So these are just, I'm just taking you through a little bit of the thought process, bringing a little bit of the complexity, so that I just want to come to a point of humility, of asking far more questions, being far less absolute, being far less aggressive.
Yeah.
If we don't learn these prophetic adab, this is where we're going to continue to be mistaken, to harm people, to harm ourselves, and to create far greater discord in our spaces, in our homes, and in our community.
Jazakallah khair, Shaykh Yasir. Some really deep insight, and I really benefited from that. Barakallah feek. I liked how you mentioned the other dimension of this discussion, and that is the profiteering. Many people might not consider, and I remember that, even when they were discussing locally, how bringing a marijuana dispensary will bring in all kinds of money to the local government and the city, if it allows that to come into its area. And I think, I guess anyone listening, this was just like a sample of how meaningful engagement of social issues looks like. It's definitely a layered discussion. And I really think on the other end of this, we need to be very careful, because sometimes when we look at it through the lens of voting, it makes the issue very binary. Oh, I'm either going to vote this way, and that's against my beliefs because I think this is haram, or I'm going to vote that way with the intent of saving those individuals who are, their lives are completely, um, uh, completely ruined by the prison industrial complex, where real change happens not through those binaries, but through another discussion or other efforts that need to be made. Well, why do I need to buy into that reality where we have a prison industrial complex that does this? What reforms need to happen to laws in order to really change the nature of the prison system? That's a bigger effort that needs to be made beyond the scope of what voting would possibly do for you. And beyond that, the philosophy behind it. The philosophy behind it is one that is not Islamic, because from our Islamic perspective, and this is a big discussion to be had, is laws and consequences and punishment are not what change people. If what we seek here is to reform society through not allowing drugs to become so rampant and dominant laws are not going to do that. That's not what rehabilitates people from an Islamic perspective. Oh yeah, well, people, criminals are continuing to, quote unquote, criminals are continuing to consume and peddle this drug, even though the consequence is X. All right, we're going to add to the consequence and make it and we're going to add to that, and we're going to make a 3 strikes law. If you're caught with this amount of drugs, you're going to be sent to life in prison, and so on and so forth. That's not the Islamic perspective to bettering society. Oh yeah, you do it again, we're going to punish you even harder. Oh yeah, you do it again, we're going to completely end your life. So I think that's the discussion that needs to be had. It's not, oh, vote this or else you're going against your deen, or vote that or else you're helping ruin the lives of innocent people by the prison industrial complex. So I guess I just wanted to add that reflection there, that's why we said in the beginning of this halaqah that type of civic engagement is much more meaningful and impactful than dealing with things through the lens of voting this way or that. Not that voting is not significant, but that the impact that this type of engagement might have is far more effective. Allah alam.
So we're getting like pretty late, and I know I can tell. I know my shuyukh very well, so I can tell when they're starting to get like worn down and tired. And so
I'm not worn down or tired, and I don't want any of your outs. How about that?
So I'm going. I do just want to. I want to highlight 3 points that I would want to push back on. I don't know if we're going to have a part 2, a part 3, or if we'll get to them, but I want to put them down on record for people who are listening, and I want to put them down on record for our mashayikh, right? Because there's like 3 pushbacks I would have to what was just said. Not that I disagree with them, but I just think there's other parts of our conversation now that I can go back to, and we seem to have contradicted ourselves a little bit in certain places, right? So
what is that?
Yeah. So one area is if the distilled answer to my question about how do I make these prioritizations is that this is a very difficult and complex issue that I don't think we're going to be able to really give you, like you're not going to get that, right? Then when I go back to the conversation we had about people who are engaging in the 2-party system much more deeply than you or me or Shaykh Osamah are, right? And we were worried about those people losing their values. And I was saying, well, some of them will tell you it's not about losing my values. It's about I'm making judgment calls about what the greater good is, right? If like the answer that you just gave seems to support those people's positions in general, right?
Why?
Because it's very reasonable then for someone to say, I see a clear path to betterment if I told the Democratic line on a lot of issues that I may disagree with now. And I'm not abandoning my positions on them. I'm still a Muslim. I still believe Allah is the primary lawgiver, and I love Allah and His Messenger, and I'm not believing these things are good. But the way for me to get ahead, I believe that I'm going to be able to do way more good if I grow in my political standing. And the way for me to get ahead right now is that I have to swallow a lot of stuff that I don't like or I don't agree with, and I may even have to push for them when I'm campaigning or when I'm
How did
running.
what I say endorse that?
Yeah.
Be-
How?
I'll tell you exactly how. I'll tell you exactly how, right? Because the whole answer you gave, from what I understood from you, now this is me, this is not some outsider who's listening.
No, yeah,
all right?
great.
Yeah.
This is useful. Yeah.
Is that you're not going to get like you're not going to be able to really get a clear answer on what to prioritize and how to prioritize.
I don't think I
Right.
said that. I mean, I said two things in my mind. I said two things. One thing I said was, at the end, after processing all that information that I received on these presentations around this question, right? To me, right, as I understood it, the clear harms outweighed the benefits, right? So for me, the question of legalization became a no, right? Now the other point that I made around this, like seeking, it was that if you're going to take a decision around any of these issues or take a step and you're not factoring in the religious opinion, you're not seeking religious scholarship's guidance, then you're going down a path that is problematic and shaky. So not one time did I indicate that someone can choose on their own subjectivities to decide what they should do without seeking, some semblance of like you. I mean, this idea that I can, I can go upon these issues and go to them and just use whatever my basic subjective knowledge of the religious discourse is to say, well, I'm coming from a place of morality, I'm coming from a place of Islam, I'm coming from a place of mercy and justice, and I haven't had any critical conversations with Islamic scholarship. I haven't taken actual legal dispensations to go and do certain things. Then I said clearly that's problematic, right? So I don't know why what I said.
I appreciate that clarification.
No,
Yeah.
absolutely not.
Yeah.
Like exactly, like judgment calls based on what? I'm making judgment calls based for the greater good based on what? Yani based on my understanding of maqasid al-sharia and the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and so on, or just on my pure gut feelings.
By the way, Zaid, I think maybe perhaps why you came to your conclusion is because I keep on emphasizing how nuanced and complex these issues are. And of course, I'm going to continue to emphasize that because, see, on both sides of the spectrum, right, this is what happens. We say, like, people say, oh, these shuyukh, they make these categorical decisions because they don't understand the nature of how politics work. They don't understand the complexities of these issues. They don't understand how it manifests, right? And no, I'm not claiming expertise on this issue, but I appreciate the nuance. I appreciate the complexity. I appreciate, based on what I'm learning and understanding and having discussions with all sorts of, experts in these fields, how this stuff manifests. And I want to develop that as a part of our communal adab, right?
Yeah.
Is that, this is how I try to conceive of these issues.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, when I make an opinion, when I take a judgment, it's a judgment that is informed, right, by the Quran, by the Sunnah, by the fiqh of the fuqaha, by the experts in these fields, right? Whether they're lawyers, historians, legislators, etc., to then say, okay, wallahu ta'ala alam, this is the best opinion.
Yeah.
But for the average person, even the person who's saying, I'm going to be politically active and engaged, I'm going to go, and I'm not grounded through scholars, okay? Because someone can say, well, I studied Islam when I was in college, or I've listened to plenty of lectures. I know what morality is. I don't need some sheikh to tell me what is moral, immoral. That is when we're starting to really completely dilute the lines of expertise, right? And understanding, no, Islamic scholarship, there is such a thing as Islamic scholarship. There is such a thing as Islamic scholars, people who've dedicated and committed their lives to understanding the Quran and the Sunnah. Let's not forget for a moment, brothers, let's just take this to a slightly different path for a second, which is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the truth, and that is the Quran. And the Prophet ﷺ is the walking manifestation of that truth, and that is the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And so immersing ourselves as a Muslim community now, if we're saying La ilaha illallah Muhammadun Rasulullah is our ultimate objective in existence. Anyone who's a Muslim, their ultimate objective in life is La ilaha illallah Muhammadun Rasulullah, right? And everything succumbs to that reality. Everything succumbs to that reality.
Yeah.
So I want that to be my fundamental objective. Now, my best bet as a common Muslim is to say, well, I am not someone who's steeped in the language of the Quran and Sunnah. I don't have scholarship in that space. So let me identify legitimate scholarship to talk to them, to get their informed opinion about how they view this aspect of these issues. Let me build that out as a repertoire of my adab of how I seek knowledge, I seek understanding.
Yeah.
And but to assume that for myself, whether politically or Islamically or historically or in any capacity, that's where I think we just go awry communally speaking. Everyone assumes they know and they are in the position to inform what should be and what shouldn't be. I just want it to be as a collective, a humble practice, from mashayikh to everyone else.
So just to add, yeah, exactly, and that's why we mentioned the issue of tawakkuf. Refraining from judgment in our day and age is often presented in a very negative light. What do you mean? You're a person who's involved and you're an activist and you read and things like that, and you don't have an opinion. You should put your opinion out there. Your opinion matters, right? You need to. How could you just refrain from judgment, right?
You should do a program once a week that has conversations about big issues.
Exactly, right? So the issue of tawakkuf is and refraining from judgment is not a bad thing until because the person who decides on their own accord to just yalij abwab al-haram and just to walk through those doors and allow him or herself to promote something that is categorically haram and prohibited in our religion, that person's doing something that should not easily be done. And I'm going to underline easily. It should not easily be done. That person's going to be held accountable for their decisions before Allah Azza wa Jal, because our scholars, they show us, great caution in the issue of halal and haram, especially when it comes to allowing haram to be done or doing it yourself. What needs to be in place in order for someone to do that, the darura and the necessity and the assessment of that darura and necessity, so it's not something that should be loosely done. We're not saying that you can't do anything. I hope no one walks away with that perception. Since you're not a sheikh and you're not a scholar and you don't know, and you might not have access to those who do know, so that means just stay in your home and do nothing. No one's saying that at all by any stretch. But in certain parts of this discussion where it becomes like a big decision on your values, especially when you want to get involved and plug yourself into a political party and and move up the ranks, that reality needs a much more diligent approach, not a loose one. Allah, amen.
I'm leaving space for you, Shaykh Yasir, because you wanted to jump in.
No, I was just going to emphasize that I think, one of the unfortunate features of our modern day is this constant pressure. We live as if we're under a pressure cooker. And I feel like that's mustana. It's manufactured in so many ways, right? I don't feel we should live as if we're living in a pressure cooker. I think we should calm down. I think we should assess. I think we should, seek Allah's guidance and forgiveness. I think we should ask questions. And when we make a decision, whatever that decision is, we do it with humility, seeking Allah's forgiveness. We've done our due diligence. We've asked the people we need to ask. وَتَوَكَّلْنَا عَلَى اللَّهِ وَنَسْأَلُ اللَّهَ الْعَافِيَةَ, right? And I think that is as an approach to life is a very meaningful approach. And I don't want people in this modern time where everything is moving at a ridiculous pace to assume that they have to keep up with that pace, because if they don't, they're somehow irrelevant or they're discredited as being, meaningful human beings. No, that's not the case. Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. The most dignified amongst you are the ones who are most God conscious. I think Muslims should be very proactive every single day of our lives. I don't think we should be lazy. I don't think we should be apathetic. I don't think we should be bums. I don't think we should just, sit on the side and just kind of like, look around. No, I think we should wake up. We should pray Fajr. We should make our afkar and our awrad. Brothers and sisters, if I don't realize that I am nothing in this dunya, and I want you to pay very close attention to what I'm saying, that I am nothing in this world without the aid and the support and the tawfiq of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then I've completely missed the mark. No matter what I'm doing in the social political space, if I'm not in a place where I'm constantly working on my relationship with Allah, my 5 daily prayers, my sunan, my afkar, my remembrances, my awrad, my litanies, my relationship with the Quran. This is not this is not a question of being well, I'm not a sheikh or a mullah like you. No. That's a question of just your every single Muslim, their life, إِذَا دَعَاكُمْ لِمَا يُحْيِيكُم. If they call you, why didn't you answer to the call when they were calling you to that which was going to bring you life? It is the Quran and the Sunnah and the way of al-Islam, this religion that brings life, that brings salvation, that brings wellness. And so as a Muslim, I have to be in my spiritual practice steeped in that reality, right? I can't think about masalih and mafasid, about benefits and harms, and completely be neglecting the spiritual realm, right? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made it clear in endless parts of the Quran. In tansurullaha yansurukum, right? In tansurullaha yansurukum wa yuthabbit aqdamakum. If you bring victory to Allah, Allah will bring victory to you and He will make your feet firm. And so the pathway of go man atani mashiyan ataituhu harwala. Those who go to Allah walking, Allah will come to them running in the manner that is befitting to Him, of course. So let us just, as we're closing now, because we've been going for almost 2 hours, let us just not forget that at the end of the day, we've been having a discussion around politics and political engagement. But in the net of our existence and our salvation, bima'na, meaning, if you put yourself in an ukhrawi orientation, so you and I and everyone who's listening right now, we're in the afterlife. And we're standing for our hisab. What percentage of that muhasabah on the Day of Judgment is going to be relegated to political involvement, political engagement, political voting, whatever, the whole political discourse we've been having? What percentage? Have we considered these questions, right? How much is going to go into my personal spirituality, my personal devotion, my personal acts of worship, my sinfulness, right? My good deeds, my actions? How much is it going to go into my family and how much I cared for my family and tended to their needs? How much is it going to go into my relationship with my neighbors? How much is it going to go into the things that I did in life, the habits that I developed, the things that I watched, the places that I went, the relationships that I had, right? If you go through the process of really thinking about muhasabah, what percentage is this political discourse going to have in that greater scheme of things? And that process, that project, thing will at least help you put things into perspective, right? That's all at the end of the day that I'm advocating for. It's putting things into perspective, being thoughtful, asking critical questions, being humble, seeking guidance, asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness. That's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sitr with tawfiq wal hidayah. Brothers and sisters, in this dunya, we're just, at the end of the day, we're stumbling. We're just like, we're crawling over each other as babies in Pampers. We're just trying to figure out how we're going to get some milk. And, we're barely kind of eking our way through this dunya. So let's just do it in a way that is humble and thoughtful, regardless of what you choose to do. Mm-hmm. And really, really seek the pathway of La ilaha illallah Muhammadun Rasulullah. Always seek that. Put that as your qibla. Don't tokenize Islam in your life. Don't turn Islam into some token thing like, yeah, I'm a Muslim, of course. Yeah, of course, Islam is whatever. Yeah, of course, but, and then I live in the but side of the equation. You know, I just live in that realm, and I like, yeah, Islam is a given. These morals are a given, but the real world. Talk to me as someone who lives in the real world. Yeah. By the way, I live in the real world too. You know, and you live in the real. We all live in the real world. What is the real world? Like, people say things like that. What is the, you know, I live in the real world. I'm trying to have, you guys want to stick in the 14th century, or you want to go back to the, you know, Qarn al-Zaman. No, what is the real world? What is reality? What is this dunya and the akhirah? If we're going to have these conversations, let's have it, but let's have it to the fullest extent of what this conversation, inshallah ta'ala, needs to be for our wellness in this life and the next. Allahu Akbar.
Jazakallah khair, Shaykh. If you both allow me to have the final like statement and then
Please.
close, inshallah. So just on the last point Shaykh Yasir was making about that question, we actually dove into that quite a bit at the start of episode 1. So again, if you didn't hear episode or part 1 of this discussion, we did actually spend quite a bit of time going to what role does engagement as a whole play, and then, you know, where does political engagement fit into that, and specifically from a religious perspective. So that we did actually do a lot of work on trying to define that for people. So inshallah, if you're going to engage in that question out and you haven't listened to the beginning of part 1, I would ask you to go back and listen to it.